Imagine a place of pain and darkness, where suffering seems to have no end and the feeling of abandonment is eternal. Now, think, does hell really exist? And if it exists, is it really a place of fire and torture, where souls are condemned to suffer forever? Would God really create a place like this, where souls would spend an eternity of torment? The vision of hell is one of the most controversial and frightening topics out there. And when we think of hell, images of fire, screams, and despair come to mind almost automatically. But is this view really correct? Does what most people believe about hell line up with what the Bible actually says? Or are we basing our beliefs on interpretations, ancient paintings, and movies rather than understanding what the scriptures really teach about this place? Today we are going to dive deep into the Bible to discover what is really said about hell. Let's unravel the mysteries, understand the meanings behind the words, and explore every detail of the scriptures. After all, knowing the truth about hell can change our entire perspective on the purpose of life, the destiny of the soul, and even what it means to follow God. And make no mistake, the answers can be very different from what you imagine. But before we get into these deep mysteries, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. Here you will find videos that address controversial and revealing topics like this, always seeking to clarify the hidden truths of the Bible and answer the questions you were always afraid to ask. So, activate the bell so you don't miss any content, and share this video with those you know are also looking for answers to these complex questions. So, why does the concept of hell arouse so much fear and curiosity? Since ancient times, people have tried to understand what happens after death. In the Old Testament, for example, we find a word that many associate with hell, Sheol. But contrary to what many think, Sheol was not exactly a place of eternal torment. In fact, it was described as a place where all the dead went, both just and unjust. It was a kind of kingdom of the dead, where there was no pain or pleasure, just a dark and empty existence, far from God. But over time, the vision of hell changed. In the New Testament, we see Jesus talking about a place called Gehenna, a valley outside Jerusalem where animal remains, garbage, and even, according to some reports, the bodies of criminals were burned. Jesus used this royal location to symbolize what could happen to those who rejected God, a terrible, fiery fate. But did he speak from a literal place? Or was the use of this fire just a way of explaining how serious a life away from God would be? Stay with us until the end, because the answers may surprise you. After all, understanding what the Bible really says about hell can lead us to rethink our own faith and how we live our lives today. The Bible mentions hell on several occasions, but is hell really as we imagine it? Is there really a place where souls are eternally damned? In the next few minutes, let's dive into a journey through the scriptures to understand what they really tell us about hell. At the outset, it is important to understand that the concept of hell did not appear all at once, but was shaped over time. In the Old Testament, for example, we find a term called Sheol, a mysterious place where the dead would go. However, it was not described as a place of eternal punishment, but rather a space where everyone, good or bad, stayed after death. Imagine living for millennia, hearing these stories without fully understanding what happens to the soul after death. Would Sheol be a place of peace or torment, or just a shadow of what we know? As time passes, we see the idea of hell gaining new layers in the New Testament. Jesus, for example, speaks of a place called Gehenna, a term that refers to the valley of Hinnom outside Jerusalem, where the remains of animals and, according to some reports, even the bodies of criminals were burned. Jesus used this image to explain what could happen to those who rejected God, a fate marked by fire. But was this fire literal or symbolic? This is a question that theologians have debated for centuries. While some believe the description is literal, others say the fire symbolizes complete separation from God, which in itself would be eternal torment. And that's when another question arises. Is hell really eternal? Or is it just temporary, a kind of purification for the soul? Now, if I told you that the very concept of eternity may have been translated inaccurately, that's right. In Greek, The word aionios can mean eternal or simply a period of time. Is hell really eternal, or is it just a purification phase before redemption? Throughout the New Testament, references to hell seem to take on an even more alarming tone. In Revelation, hell is described as the lake of fire, a final destination for Satan, his angels, and all those who reject God. But what does this really mean? Some believe that the lake of fire is not a physical place, but a metaphor for total annihilation, a kind of second death where a being ceases to exist completely. And here comes another big question. Would hell be a place of eternal torment or a final point where the soul simply ceases to exist? There are theological currents that defend both interpretations. Some see hell as a literal place where souls are tormented forever. Others, however, believe that hell is a metaphor for the destruction of the soul, which would explain the term eternal death. Now, why did Jesus speak so harshly about hell? Many scholars believe that these warnings were intended to generate a reaction in the listener, a clear choice between spiritual life and death. At the time, intense and symbolic language was common in religious speeches. Jesus wanted people to understand the consequences of their actions in a way that really made an impact. So, if hell represents a complete separation from God, wouldn't the greatest suffering lie precisely in this irreversible loss of everything that is good? This brings us to one last question. Does hell really exist? Or would it be a symbolic creation to help us understand the need for reconciliation with God? Some scholars suggest that hell would be a natural consequence of human choices. That is, when someone chooses to live outside the presence of God, they end up finding a type of existential hell, far from everything that is divine and good. So, after all, what can we conclude about hell? Would it be a place of eternal fire, of perpetual suffering, or a metaphor for what it is like to live far from God? The Bible leaves many mysteries, but one thing is certain. It invites us to reflect deeply on our choices and what they mean for our eternity. If you've stayed this far, it means you want to know more about these hidden truths. So, continue following the channel. Leave your comment about what you think, and of course, share this video so that other people can understand the true biblical vision of hell. After all, nothing is more important than knowing the truth. Why is there this idea of a place of torment after death? Was there always a notion of hell in the Bible, or did this concept develop over time? To understand hell, we first need to delve into the origins of this term in Scripture. In the Old Testament, we find a place called Sheol. But contrary to what many imagine, Sheol was not a place of eternal suffering. It appears described as the kingdom of the dead, where everyone went after death, regardless of their conduct in life. It is as if it were a dark and silent region, a type of underworld far from God, but without the characteristics of punishment that we associate with modern hell. Picture the scene. In ancient times, upon hearing about Sheol, a person would have an image of a vast, silent darkness, a place where there is no life but also no suffering. So, why has this idea changed over time? How did the vision of a hell of fire and torment end up consolidated in the Scriptures? With the arrival of the New Testament, the concept of hell began to gain new contours. Jesus, in his speeches, refers to a place called Gehenna. And to understand what Gehenna is, we need to look at the historical context. The term comes from Gehinnom, or Valley of Hinnom, which was located on the outskirts of Jerusalem. There, historically, remains of garbage, animals, and even, according to some reports, bodies of condemned people were burned. When Jesus talks about the fate of those who reject God, he uses this image of the burning valley to convey something powerful and symbolic. Think about the scene. A valley always burning, with smoke, a place where nothing can survive. But did Jesus speak from a literal place? Or did he use fire and smoke as metaphors to illustrate the severity of spiritual consequences? Jesus mentions Gehenna as a place of unquenchable fire, a shocking image that deeply affected the imagination of people at the time. But, according to some theologians, this reference could be interpreted not as eternal punishment in a literal sense, but as the final consequence for those who choose to live far from God. Now, In Revelation, in the last book of the Bible, the idea of hell seems to reach its peak with the image of the lake of fire. In it, Satan, his angels, and all those who rejected God are cast into an apparently definitive condemnation. But what does this lake of fire mean? Could it be a literal representation of a place where souls are burned eternally? Many scholars believe that the lake of fire is a metaphor representing final spiritual death, the state of eternal destruction of the soul, a type of second death. This idea is called annihilationism, the theory that, instead of suffering eternally, the souls of those who reject God would simply cease to exist, being consumed by this fire. Here, Revelation brings us a scenario that is more than a simple place of suffering. He talks about a final destination where everything evil and corrupt disappears. But is it possible that this second death is a symbolic way of talking about total separation from God, the complete end of any relationship with the Creator? This question leads us to reflect. Is hell really eternal? Or would it be a final point where evil is completely destroyed with no chance of returning? Another theological current interprets hell not as a place of literal fire, but as a spiritual condition of total separation from God. In passages like Matthew 25, verse 41, Jesus talks about the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Many believe that Jesus was not speaking of a literal fire, but was using symbolic language to express the suffering of being eternally separated from God. Now, think about how this changes perspective. Hell is not just a place, but a condition of total loss. Imagine a life without any trace of goodness, joy, or peace. For those who believe, God is the source of all that is good. Therefore, hell would be the complete absence of all these qualities. In this sense, hell becomes less a physical place and more a state of absolute emptiness, of lack of what is divine. It is like living in a spiritual desert, where the absence of God is the true torment, an existence isolated from what makes life meaningful. But here an essential question arises. Is it possible that one day this state of separation will be reversed? Or is it definitive? This is one of the most discussed questions over the centuries. The word eternal, translated from the Greek aionios, can mean both an infinite duration and an indeterminate period of time. This ambiguity leads some to believe that hell may not be eternal, but a temporary state, a kind of purification before final redemption. The concept of a temporary hell, or purgatory, is a belief held in some Christian traditions, but for others it is completely rejected. The idea that souls could be purified and ultimately reconciled with God is seen as an expression of divine mercy, a chance for redemption even after death. But then, what would be the truth? The Bible offers both passages that suggest the eternity of hell, and others that seem to indicate a final destruction, an end to suffering. And this duality leads to deep reflections on God's justice and mercy. We have reached the end of our journey. After everything we have explored, perhaps the greatest message about hell is precisely the warning about the choices we make. The Bible seems to invite us to reflect on how our lives align with God's purpose. The true essence of hell, according to many interpretations, is living far from God by one's own decision or by refusing to follow his path. For many theologians, hell is not just a place of punishment, but a natural consequence of a life that chose to turn away from God and everything he represents. And in the end, the big question remains, would hell then be a choice made in life, a state that can be avoided? Each of us needs to look at our own beliefs and reflect on what the Bible really teaches about what is to come. And now I want to know, what do you think about hell? Is it literal or symbolic? Eternal or temporary? Leave your comment below. Let's talk about this controversial and fascinating topic. And of course, if you like the content, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos where we continue to explore the truths of the Bible that are not always so clear. Until next time,